Good evening, everybody. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our summer series here at Congregation Beth Am. For those of you who are new, welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Howard Lupovitch, or Howie, as I'm also known in this building. Just full disclosure, I'm not only speaking here, this is also my synagogue. Many of us here, this is our synagogue. When I'm not doing this in this room, you come back on Saturday morning, I'm reading from that room. Those are very different personas, but don't worry, I'll keep it straight. You don't want to mix those two things. Well, welcome everyone to our series on American Jews, the politics of American Jews. Now, sometimes when you get a series like this, you have to explain why it's important, why it's worth learning about. But I think the politics of American Jews in many ways speaks for itself. In many ways, our current political outlooks, our current political agendas, and as you notice, I speak in plural, this is something we think about all the time. We think about, we discuss, we debate, sometimes constructively, sometimes painfully, we divide, we're divided in certain ways. The topic itself, I don't think requires any explanation. But I want to be clear from the outset that what we're going to do in this series is not just rehash current events or what's happening in American Jewish politics today, but rather I want to suggest from the outset, and this is a thread I want to carry through the series, that one of the ways to probe beyond the frustration of the fact that we don't always agree, the fact that one point of view thinks the other one is one-dimensional or narrow or unreflective. One way to get past that stalemate we seem to be in sometimes is, for lack of a better word, or to put it simply, perspective. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at how American Jews have dealt with certain political issues, the different political currents of American Jews, and we're going to look at them in the past. Mostly, this evening, we're going to begin about 150 years ago and then move toward the present. So we're not going to deal specifically with what the rabbis of the Talmud called Inyana de Yoma, affairs of the day, current events. We're not going to deal with them directly, but I think you'll see as the series goes on that implicitly we're going to be dealing with them all the time. You will hear things on a topic seemingly unrelated or not directly related to something we talk about today. You'll say, oh, that reminds me of. And what I want to encourage you is at the end, when I'm done with my spiel, we'll have some questions and answers. And obviously, if you want to ask questions or discuss something that we actually learn about the past, by all means. But the question and answer session, that's when, if you want to turn to something current, that's the most useful time to do that. So I want to put it out there. If you're seeing a connection to something present day, it's not surprising. One of the things about politics is past and present often weave together very seamlessly. I think you're also going to discover we come with different points of view. We come with different political outlooks. When you study something in historical perspective, you wind up testing and challenging all of these outlooks. So I should say that there will be points when that which you believe now will be challenged by things we see in the past. On the other hand, though, because this challenging is going to take place across the board, you'll get to hear the opposing viewpoint also be challenged. So you can enjoy that part. But what I would urge you, as often the most important thing when talking about anything political these days, is come in with an open mind, come in with a blank slate. What I always try to do is you check your ideological and political baggage at the door when you come in. You come in with an open mind, you'll get so much more out of it. Then when you leave, you can pick up your baggage and go back to whatever you were thinking before. That's fine, but you'll at least have a little bit more perspective on what you think. So as a point of departure, we're starting there. Now, since we're going to be talking about politics, can everyone hear me, by the way? Okay. And everyone has a handout, by the way? Let's pretend I said that right at the beginning. Since we're talking about politics, we have to start by defining some terms, because there are political terms we often use, and this is something we are all guilty of these days, myself included. We use certain terms, we use them very loosely, we use them, well, in a way that's almost a little bit sloppy, and I want to start by defining them, especially because some of these terms, what they mean now, meant very different things even 100 years ago. So let's start with the two terms, conservative and liberal. Good place to start. Now, I'm not speaking in specifically Jewish terms. I'm speaking more broadly in what these terms mean. Now, most people today, whether you're conservative or not, most people think that conservative and right-wing are synonymous. And the more conservative you are, the more right-wing you are, and vice versa. The more right-wing you are, the more conservative you are. In its original and classic definition, defined, for example, by Sir Edmund Burke, who was the original European conservative thinker, or by a political philosopher named Karl Mannheim, who wrote a book called Conservatism. Terrific book. Conservative is not synonymous with right-wing. The original meaning, the classic meaning of the word conservative would be closer to what we would call moderate and centrist. And so in its classic meaning, the opposite of conservative is not liberal. The opposite of conservative is radical in both directions. Conservatives prefer gradual, incremental change, but conservatives recognize that change is necessary. So someone like Sir Edmund Burke, who lived in late 18th century England, he was the most outspoken critic of the French Revolution, that great original liberal revolution, which we will define in a second. And he felt, he thought the tumult and the violence and the upheaval, he was very critical of that, but he was equally critical of absolute monarchy. He didn't want anything too far to the right, anything too far to the left. His conservatism, which is classic conservatism, means moderate and centrist. By the same token, liberal is also something which is often understood. Now, I'm going to tell you what a liberal originally meant, and you're going to go, oh. In about 2 minutes, you're going to go, oh, I think so. All right? Originally, a liberal referred to the following set of ideas. First of all, civil rights for all. Well, in their original statement, the original liberals talked about civil rights, equal rights for all men. And they were very literal about it. When they said all men are created equal, they weren't speaking colloquially to refer to all people. They meant men and not women. And they also didn't mean all men. They meant propertied men and not poor men. They also meant white men and not men of color, and Christian men and not someone who was not Christian, not Jews. Protestant men and not Catholic. So really, when someone like Thomas Jefferson said, all men are created equal, or when Thomas Paine or John Locke said all men are created equal, what they really meant was all white, property, Christian men are equal. That's what they really meant. So that sense of equality was part of liberalism. Careers open to talent. No one should be denied the right to do that which they are capable of doing. That was also the elimination of hereditary privilege. No one should be advantaged based on what status they were born in. That much I think is obvious. But liberals also believed in small government, not big. That's different than what we associate with liberalism now. They believed in a philosophy of government called laissez-faire, which is a French term that means the government does not get involved in the lives of individuals. John Locke put it best when he said, that government is best which governs least. Small government originally was a liberal idea. Okay? Now, it means something different now. What I just described to you, by the way, pretty much, if I just described to you and didn't tell you what I was talking about, you would have said I was talking about a Republican. Because 21st century Republican, and I mean Republican classic, not Republican, not others, is very close to liberalism in its original meaning. Now, what we refer to as liberalism now is really closely more associated with what was once upon a time called progressivism. The notion that all of these things, civil rights for all, extension of the franchise, careers open to talent, but there was this notion that limited government was insufficient, that there are times and occasions when the government that does not get involved leaves too many individuals at the mercy of unscrupulous other individuals. And we'll see examples of that. Well, an early example of that we'll see tonight with respect to slavery. There's this notion that the government needs to be more involved. I should also mention that the original liberals were anti-democratic. They believed that all citizens should get the right to vote, but they didn't believe that everyone should be a citizen. They felt that while everyone should have the same civil rights, or all men, or all white property Christian men should have the same civil rights, the only ones who should be allowed to participate in government through voting and standing for office were those who were propertied and those who were educated. They're the only ones who had something at stake. Their notion was uneducated people, if they were given the right to vote, would be too easily swayed by a demagogue. They'd be too easily led astray. That is a classic liberal idea. Now, I start this because when we read texts from the past, from the last century, from the 19th century, words like conservative and liberal, when they're used, I want you to understand their proper context. We can play the same game with Democrat and Republican. Now, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party came first. The Democratic Party, which was originally, it's a little confusing, originally they were called the Democratic Republicans. Their opponent, or their counterpart, were the Federalists. The Federalists believed in a strong central government. The Democrats, like Thomas Jefferson, like Patrick Henry, they believed they were strong defenders of states' rights. They thought the state should be the ultimate arbiter, except in certain cases when the federal government was necessary. But they were classically liberal in their formation. The Republican Party was founded later in the 1850s, and one of the two main issues on which it was founded was the question of tariffs, negotiating between North and South, but above all, really the question of slavery. And of course, the question of states' rights versus federal rights. Now, for a long time, I'll just give you, for a long time, for example, the Bible Belt and southern states were avowedly Democrat and not Republican. It was President Richard Nixon when he was running for president. He's the one who flipped them. And the way he did it actually is something that we'll see a precursor of that maybe even this evening. So we have to be careful of the way we use these terms. Their meanings change. Okay, so if we've clarified that, let me say a few words now about, well, what it means to be, what was distinct about America, American politics, American culture, and also, in a very broad strokes, what it means to be Jewish in America in its political context. So when we talk about American politics or American culture or American society, the first question we have to address is what some historians and others have called American exceptionalism. Was the United States as a country? Is it something different? Or is it simply a continuation of its European forebears? And there are ways in which the United States, as a country, was something original and exceptional. For example, The United States was one of the first countries in the world which has no medieval legacy, certainly in terms of its politics. The United States, American politics were invented largely based on the ideas of the European Enlightenment, a set of 18th century ideas, some of which we just said: universal equality of man, the primacy of reason over faith, and various ideas like that. So the earlier ideas, the earlier notions of medieval hierarchy never really took root here. And so this was one of, if not the first country in the world that didn't have a reigning dynasty, no royalty, that didn't have an aristocracy, that didn't have guilds, state chartered guilds, that didn't have an established church. This is the first country built on the premise of the separation of religion and state, or the separation of church and state, they like to call it. Now, that's also one of the oddities, because even though there was no established church here, and even though the United States was founded on the principle of the separation of church and state, Americans themselves, as individuals, as families, as communities, are among the most religious in the world. So the tension between the separation of religion and state on the one hand, and the strong connection to religion among American citizens on the other, has always been at play. And from time to time, there have been issues, and slavery is one of them, where the difficulty in resolving or addressing the problem is because it has both a political dimension and a moral / theological / religious dimension. So the debate over slavery is a great example here. There's a political issue. The political issue is who gets to decide whether slavery is legal, states or the federal government? Do parts of the country that don't allow slaves but think slavery is wrong, do they have the right via the federal government, the central government, to tell states where slavery is permitted to get rid of them? Politically, that's problematic in terms of the 10th Amendment, the States' Rights Amendment. But like I said, there's also a moral and theological dimension. Part of the debate over slavery was that political question of federal rights or national rights versus states' rights. But part of it was also a moral dimension. Now, the first part, the political dimension, would tear the country apart for 4 years. Civil War, that's really what it was about. The moral dimension, in some ways, is the longer lasting. It preceded the Civil War. Even after the Civil War was over, it continued. There were those who, even after being defeated, felt that morally their position was more acceptable. So where can we place Jews into this messy and complex American politics? Well, I'll boil it down to you in a single statement. If you want to understand, or if you want to understand what it has meant to be Jewish in America, or to put it another way, the one thing that Jews have done in America more consistently than anything else is to become American. That's what we have done here, for better or for worse. We have embraced what it has meant to be American in terms of politics, in terms of culture, in terms of way of life. Now, the downside of that, or those who see that as something concerning, they lament the assimilation of American Jews, and they're not wrong. Assimilation, abandoning a connection to Judaism, the Jewish community, has been a consistent part of American Jewish life, American Jewish history for centuries. But that wasn't all of it. Every generation of American Jews, every generation for the last 300 years, without exception, was convinced it was the last generation. Every single one said, open society, freedom, Judaism is going to disappear. So whenever I hear lamenting, oh, Judaism is never going to survive this problem or that problem, and the young people are drifting away, I just remember that this is what we have been saying for 10 generations, and every generation was wrong. And, well, I always think it's a little bit hubris to say, they were all wrong, but we're going to be the one who get it right and watch the Jews disappear. It's just odd. Okay. But really what Jews do is become American. And we're going to come back to that when we talk specifically about the Jewish attitude toward and the Jewish participation in the debate over slavery. Now, American Jews, one of the things that created the kind of diversity among American Jews is American Jews lived all over America. There were American Jews who were Southerners. There were American Jews who were Northerners. So if you want to answer the question, what is it meant to become American? You want to see the kind of underpinning of how did Jews act? The larger question you have to ask is, how did Americans in general address a certain situation? And spoiler alert, there's more than one American view of a particular situation or issue. There's going to be more than one Jewish view. Because remember, what Jews are doing is becoming American, and if there are multiple American views, it follows that there are multiple Jewish views. Now, let's turn more specifically now to the question of slavery. What we have to do from the outset is we have to set aside 2 points of view on this, which in some ways are very radical, and they don't help. They historically have been proven to be false. All right, the first was articulated maybe 50 years ago, and this is the notion that slavery as an institution, slavery as a historical phenomenon, was started by Jews, orchestrated by Jews. Jews are entirely responsible for it. This is a myth that was created, among others, by a group known as the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan in a book called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. It's written about 50 or 60 years ago. Very interesting read. It's a conspiracy theory. Essentially, it's combining two long-standing Jewish stereotypes or conspiracy theories. One is the notion of Jewish power, embodied in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the notion of this powerful Jewish conspiracy that masterminds everything in the world, the notion that the slavery was simply one thing that the Elders of Zion were manipulating. So there's that. The other stereotype is an older Christian stereotype, which saw Jews as inherently the ultimate adversaries of Christendom. And so when you have, eventually, most slaves were part of Christian America, that itself is a complicated story because they were and they weren't. I mean, they were Christian, but white Christendom often didn't accept them fully. I mean, one of the oddities of the situation of blacks in America is how much violence was perpetrated by Black Baptists against Black Baptists by white Baptists. And I've never understood that. It's one of the great failings of the Baptist Church, but that's another story. But the point being that this notion of Jews being the adversary, the ultimate adversary of Christendom, that goes back to the notion that Jews, are guilty of deicide and are in league with the devil, combined with a modern stereotype that of Jewish power, that added up to Jews masterminded the slave trade. Slaves, the people who captured slaves, it was mostly Jews and Jews traded. It's all Jews are responsible. That's wrong. Historically, that has been shown to be wrong. Now, the flip side is, there's a very edifying view that's propagated, especially by Jews. The question where, I'll give you an example. I often ask my students, if I'm teaching undergraduate survey, and usually most of the students are Jewish, and I'll say, do you think most Jews were pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And 95% of the hands say, of course, we are anti-slavery because we believe in all these things. But they've forgotten the basic lesson one about Jews in America. Jews are becoming American. And an interesting study, and this also refutes this notion of Jews somehow masterminding the slave trade, is that the number of Jews who were there were Jewish slave traders, there were Jewish slave owners, some were better, some were worse, but the remarkable thing is that the number of Jewish slave traders and slave owners, the number of Jews involved in slavery is almost exactly proportional to the percentage of Jews in the overall population. So on the one hand, we can't say Jews are entirely responsible. On the other hand, we can't forgive and say, obviously, Jews would never condone slavery because Judaism is a moral religion. Yes, Judaism is a moral religion, but, well, for those Jews who participated in slavery, it's problematic in the same way that slavery is problematic. So now that we've laid that basic, that basic framework here, let's turn more specifically to the question of the actual Jews living in 19th century America at a time when slavery was very much part of American society. Now let's understand, the importing of slaves into America went on for 400 years. It started before Jews were even here, or before Jews were here in any significant number. The importing of slaves went on until around the year 1810, when the importing of slaves ended. Slavery continued until the Civil War. So it was very much a part of American society. It was especially part of Southern society. Now, if you ever wonder why? Why is it the Southern states had more slaves and the Northern states had fewer slaves? The temptation is to say that Northerners were somehow more moral and they didn't accept slavery. There's some truth to that, but the larger explanation is more mundane. Without sounding overly like Adam Smith or Karl Marx, it was more economic in nature. Southern states tended to be more agrarian. Northern states tended to be more industrial. The agrarian South, the farms, the plantations of the South, they were more in need of unskilled, cheap agrarian labor, as opposed to the semi-skilled or skilled labor that was necessary to drive the small factories and cottage industries of the North. So as an economic commodity, slavery was more valuable in the South than it was in the North, especially when the ultimate crop, cash crop in the South, became cotton. Now, if you don't know, cotton is a labor-intensive crop to grow. I'll be honest, I don't know that much about the details, but prior to the invention, especially of the cotton gin, when you would harvest cotton, you'd have to pick out all the seeds by hand, labor-intensive. So you needed, if you were hiring laborers and paying a wage for laborers to harvest the cotton, most of the time they're spending not cutting it from the field and making bales, but picking out the seeds. It was long, it was tedious. The per hour charge was very expensive. But if you had a labor force that could do it for nothing, well, there's real value there. That's one of the reasons why the Southern colonies, more agrarian, especially once cotton became the king, cotton became the crop, slavery became not only something that was condoned, but it became indispensable to the Southern economy. Now that situation, that difference between the Southern North, the agrarian South and the industrial North, this wasn't an anomaly. It has its parallels elsewhere in the world. I'll give you one example. The largest state in 19th century Europe was Austria-Hungary, Habsburg monarchy. The western part of this monarchy was largely industrial. The eastern part of this monarchy was largely agrarian, especially in Hungary. And they didn't have slavery per se, but in the eastern part of this monarchy, they had serfdom all the way until 1848 because they needed the cheap serf labor. It's very similar. That east-west divide is parallel to the northwest divide of the United States. So we find as this slave-driven economy, the agrarian economy of the South, as it took root, as it developed, slaves were seen as essential. And Jews, especially Jews who lived in the South, and now we're going to see, it wasn't only Jews, but it was especially Jews who lived in the South, they recognized this. Now we have this invaluable perspective early on, long before the debate over slavery heated up. The debate over slavery didn't really get intense until the 1850s when we approached the Civil War. Earlier on, there was differences of opinion, but it simply was differences of opinion. So we have this early perspective on slavery by a man whose name was Moses Elias Levy. He actually was, he was a Sephardic Jew. He came from North Africa. He came to America. He lived in the South. He first managed and then owned a plantation. And in 1829, or by the end of the 1820s, even though he was very much part of a slave-driven economy, he himself joined the anti-slavery movement, known as the abolition movement, which was very new in the 1820s, but he became interested in it, and in 1829, he published a treatise called A Plan for the Abolition of Slavery. I brought you an excerpt. I don't know if we're going to read the whole thing. Look at text number 1 on your handouts, okay? Now remember, this is a slave owner who's making the case against slavery. He's arguing for the abolition of slavery. In some ways, he's similar to Thomas Jefferson here, though not as eloquent. Okay, listen to what he writes. Having devoted my attention to the abolition of slavery for the last 20 years, under peculiarly advantageous circumstances, I feel anxious to contribute my mite, a little bit, to the general stock of information on the interesting subject, that those who are manfully laboring to effect this great object may be in possession of all information. In other words, I want people to understand what the situation is really about. Okay, skip to the next paragraph. But the more I examine the subject, the more complicated it appeared to me, and often did I, in tone of despair, pronounce the case hopeless. By hopeless, I meant resolving the debate, resolving the question of slavery. This may be easily conceived when it is said that in tracing effects to causes, we find that the present vices of the slave are but the effects of those of the owner, and that those of the owner are likewise the effects resulting from those of the slave, and that consequently the moral degradation of both owner and slave renders any reforms originating in themselves impractical. What he's addressing here is two sides of a debate. Those who defended slavery would say, especially the bad behavior, the cruelty of slave owners, would say the only reason a slave owner is ever cruel is because the bad behavior of the slave forces the slave owner to act cruel. If slaves would all just listen and behave themselves, and slave owners wouldn't need to beat them. That's the argument. I know, that's a difficult argument to swallow. By the same token, for those who are arguing in favor of the emancipation of slaves, who are saying that the slaves themselves have become morally degraded, their personalities have been eroded by being enslaved, he said, it's not as simple as that. You can't simply say the reason to free the slaves is that they'll become better people. That wasn't exactly clear to him. Okay? The severe measures adopted by the master, he writes, seemed called for by the vices of the slave, and these again are requisite to pamper the weakness and passions of the avaricious master. So the slaves behave badly to placate the master or to somehow to get him to be nicer, and you have this vicious circle of a whole society which is morally imploding on itself. Now note here, he's not making a political argument at this point. He's making a moral argument. He's saying that slavery is undermining the moral fabric, not only of slaves, but also of owners, and Southern society, which he was part of in general, is being undermined by the very presence of slavery. The black and white inhabitants of the colonies cannot possibly be expected to sympathize or unite, at least for some time, in civil or domestic intercourse. The eastern and some of the middle states of America afford a good example of this fact. Nay, I will even instance the Society of Friends in that country. In other words, further north, that class of individuals have ever displayed indefatigable zeal in the cause of emancipation. They will make any effort to promote this their darling object, yet we have no instance of their taking a genteel colored family or person by the hand of unqualified friendship, intermarrying with them, or even mixing in social or convivial pleasure. In other words, he's saying, he's spoken about the evils of slavery, but he also said, let's not kid ourselves. Those who are advocating the abolition of slavery are not calling for the freed slaves to become equal citizens, maybe equal under the law, but not social equals. He's basically saying to the abolitionists, Get off your high horse. You may be arguing in favor of freeing the slaves, which is commendable, but you're not willing to let one of your children marry the child of a slave. You still see yourself as superior. And he's right here, because even in the North, where there wasn't slavery, there was segregation. There was a two-tiered society, which wasn't slavery, but it certainly wasn't equality. Now, what he's doing here in 1829, he's laying a kind of baseline. And he goes on to say, what will be the consequence of placing the injured and resentful, untaught Negro on a level in civil rights with the haughty and imperious civilized white? Will 9 or 10 hardy blacks submit to the contemptuous and haughty treatment of some of their white fellow citizens, when in addition to the confidence which numbers and physical strength must necessarily inspire them with, the laws afford them but the power of revenging themselves on their oppressors by stratagem, cunning, or perjury? In other words, you think if you simply free the slaves, everyone's going to live happily ever after? The slaves who are numerically more superior, with some deep-seated anger, you think what happens next is going to be peaceful and stable? What he's saying is, this is what he means by the complexity of the problem. He certainly believes that slavery must end. What he's saying is, how to do that is not as easy as one might think. You can't simply flip a switch, say the slaves are free, and everyone simply goes on their way. What he was imagining is, if slaves were all suddenly and abruptly free, they would turn on their masters, and they would turn on white people elsewhere in an act of vengeance. And there are places in the world where that's exactly what happened. Now, that potential for violence doesn't justify slavery. So, what Moses Levy is leaving us really is no resolution. He's saying there's no resolution to the problem. This book goes on for 150 pages, and he gets to the end and basically says, I'll paraphrase, you see how complicated this issue is? You were expecting me to give you a solution? There isn't one. He writes that in 1829. But more interesting, I think, for our purposes, is let's look for some more partisan views among Jews. Let's look for Jews who are defending one side or the other and see the terms in which they were defending one point of view. And an interesting case here is a Southern Jew whose name was Maurice Mayer. Now, Mayer is a very interesting story. Before he came to America, he lived in Central Europe. He came to America in the early 1850s, at a time when the debate over slavery was beginning to heat up. Before coming to America, he was among many Jews who were involved in an event in Central Europe known as the Revolutions of 1848. The Revolutions of 1848 were a series of liberal revolutions that broke out across Central Europe, from Berlin all the way down to Trieste and Rome. The goal of these revolutions was to replicate in Central Europe what had taken place in France in 1789, basically to repeat the French Revolution, to turn all of Central Europe, which at the time was ruled by kings and princes, into republics. Now, what's interesting about these revolutions, especially for our purposes, is the agenda of the revolutionaries was largely the liberal agenda: elimination of hereditary privilege, careers open to talent, removing restrictions based on religion or social class. But what's remarkable, at the top of the agenda of almost every single revolution was the emancipation of Jews. Jews in Central Europe in the 1840s, who were still second-class citizens for the most part, their emancipation was seen as the test case of liberalism in Central Europe. The notion was, the larger notion was, if everyone isn't equal, then no one is equal. And the test of everyone being equal was it had to include Jews. And so someone like Maurice Mayer in Central Europe in 1848, he took part in one of these revolutions. He fought, among other things, for Jewish emancipation as part of a larger struggle for civil equality. Now, these revolutions failed for a variety of reasons, one of which were the powers that be in Central Europe were able to regroup their armies and defeat these revolutions. Long story short, they were financed by a single Jewish family, the Rothschilds, but that's a different story. But individuals, Jews and otherwise, who were active participants in these revolutions, of which Maurice Mary was one, they basically became criminals when the revolutions are over. Many were arrested, many were hanged for treason and sedition, and as a result, many of the revolutionaries, Jewish and otherwise, fled Central Europe. Many fled Central Europe to the United States. So in the immigration history of the United States, we refer to these individuals as 48ers. Now, I know you've heard of the 49ers. Those were people from Europe who came looking for gold in 1849 after they discovered gold in Sutter's Mill in California. But the slightly lesser well-known 48ers were those who had participated in the revolutions, became outlaws, and had to flee. Maurice Mary was one. Now remember, this is an avowed liberal who fought for civic equality. He came to America. He settled in South Carolina. He settled in Charleston, which was really the heart and soul of the American South. Rhett Butler country. Well, he's the wrong example, maybe. That was really the center of slavery. And essentially of the whole Southern Cavalier mentality. And he settled there in 1850 or 1851. Within 5 years, he had become a Southerner. He still believed in civil rights. He still believed in Jewish equality. He still believed in many liberal ideas. But he also defended the right of slave owners to have slaves. In other words, he was a European liberal who had fought for equality in the revolutions of 1848, who came to the American South, became part of Southern society, became American in that way, and became a defender of slavery. Now, how did he defend slavery? Well, let me give it to you in his words. He among other things, he's one of these people who had kind of odd jobs. Never really knew what to do with them. One of the things he did, he was the American correspondent of one of the first German Jewish newspapers, which was called the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, the universal newspaper, or the global newspaper of Judaism, sort of like the World Jewish Press. Now, a title like that, people who believe in Jewish conspiracy would love that title. You see, they have something called the World Jewish Press. He became the correspondent, especially in the American South, and he wrote letters. He contributed letters and opinions to the pages, and that gives us a sense of what he thought, especially during the 1850s. So look at text number 2. This is him writing from Charleston in July of 1855. This is the point where the debate over slavery is getting intense. Quote, as I live in North America's main slave state, I likely have some knowledge in the matter. Yet I wish to ignore it as not relevant to the core of Jewish interest. Just that much might be mentioned. If Europeans were to judge by their own experience and not by adopted or concocted prejudices or by slanderous claims of the northern fanatics, abolitionists, they surely would have to express and admit to different opinions. In other words, he's talking to Europeans who are calling Americans primitive for owning slaves, and cruel and immoral. And he's basically saying, Europeans, you have to look at yourself before you judge American slave owners. The institution of slavery, as much as it may be attacked on the basis of principle, and as much as it is attacked out of a misguided philanthropy, is a charity. This is remarkable. At least the southern provinces of North America do not know the pauperism under which our North, as well as Europe, suffers so miserably. Free black people who are not slaves, most of them are poor. Aren't they better off being slaves when they get meals, and they get shelter, and they get clothing? They don't have to worry about the basic needs of life. And this is true in Europe, and this is true in America. What he's saying is there's no problem of poverty in the South. And that was false. The South was full of poor white people. But he didn't know it. He lived in Charleston. He was an upper middle class individual. And when he saw slaves, he's saying this person is much better off as a slave than what would happen to them as a free person. Okay. Number 3. Since political fanaticism attempts to take possession of power in this glorious union, and it has not given up since, it cannot be of no importance to us Jews which party may win. Now remember, there are the fanatics, and then there are the Southern slave-owning liberals. Okay, what fanatics, hidden fanatics are the abolitionists, right? It does not take a prophetic clairvoyance to claim that Jews will never be the last chosen as fanaticism's victims once it prevails. This is regardless of the shape it takes, be it religious or be it political, religious, or whatever name it might bear. Fanaticism of slavery, abolition, the Republican Party, nativism, know nothing, or the American Party, it will always threaten Jews. American Jews are fortunate that the old conservative Democratic Party was victorious in the last presidential election and has chosen James Buchanan, the old statesman, as the head of our republic for the next 4 years. What he's saying is, yes, abolition seems like a good idea, but insofar as it's fanatic, it's a radical idea. And remember, the radical is what the conservative abhors. And in this moment in time, it's the Democratic Party, which is the conservative party. That's why I explained it at the beginning. Wouldn't this have been confusing if I hadn't fleshed that out for us? Basically, he's saying that the fanatics, once they're done trying to free the slaves, their next target is going to be something about Jews they don't like. Okay? That's his rationalization for not supporting the abolitionists. Okay. One more. Text number 4. There is one curiosity I wanted to report to you in every earlier letter to the Allgemeine. Among the members of my congregation is also a Negro. He claims to be from Madagascar. He's over 70 years old. It seems, though, that he came with his Jewish masters, who have died at a young age from the Barbary. They came from North Africa. I can witness he belongs to the most eager visitors of the synagogue, whereas blacks and colored people in the South, as well as in the free North, are segregated in every public place, church, theater, etc. Our Uncle Billy takes his seat among his white co-religionists in the temple. There is but one concern he has, that by mistake he might not be buried in a Jewish cemetery, because they assume that since he's black, he's not Jewish. If it pleases God to allow me to survive him, he will, if it is within my capacity, be buried among his co-religionists rather than among the slaves or free people of color. Just how far he is concerned with this issue is shown by the fact that he lets it be known to the Christians of the city that he is a Jew and desires to be buried among his brethren. Now he's looking at this man and saying, here's my justification. You want to know how I know that in the South, that the Southern way is the preferred path for American Jews to follow and support? Here we have a Jew who was also black, who was treated like a part of this congregation in the South, whereas up north, black people are never treated like this. Just really trying to take this one example. The larger idea that comes out of Maurice Mayer is this larger justification of slavery. Now you see here, he's justifying it largely first of all, in political terms. For him, the attack on slavery is a symptom of a dangerous fanaticism. And the defense of slavery is the defense of a more stable conservatism. And he says Jews, being a minority, are always vulnerable to fanatic behavior. And whatever Jews should do, we should never support fanatical points of view. And that's his rationalization, to argue against abolition, in support and defense of slavery. But the larger point is, look, he lived in the South, he moved to Charleston, he became a Charleston guy. He's simply echoing the mentality that he was grown up in. You see a vestige of this. Well, a version of this, I would say. If you ever saw the movie Driving Miss Daisy, this is a very nice Southern woman, Jessica Tandy, Daisy, who has this lovely relationship with her driver, who's named Hope. And for the most part, it's cordial and nice, and they become close friends. But there are moments when she sees him as inherently inferior to her. She doesn't really see them, even though she sees them as friends, even though she sees them as maybe her best friend, she doesn't see them as equals. And that is something typically South. And what Maurice Mayer is really getting out here is that, yes, there was a clear hierarchy in Southern society, but Southern blacks, especially Southern slaves, were not segregated from white society. That happened after the Civil War. It's only after slavery ended. Slaves lived in the house. Slaves whose job was it to take care of the children of the master, they slept in the house in the bedroom. They were integrated in that way. Does that justify the slavery? Definitely not. It certainly helps us to understand a point of view which might seem otherwise problematic. But I would say that in many ways, Morris Mayer, this was not a typical view. If anywhere outside the South, this was the view maybe of, it's hard to know, some, maybe most Southern Jews who became Southern. But there were others who were critical of him, including the editor of the newspaper that he contributed to. Look at text number 5. The editor of this newspaper was Ludwig Philippson. Philippson, like Morris Mayer, was someone who had fought for rights in Europe, but he hadn't moved to the American South, and he hadn't done a flip-flop on slavery. Look what he writes. Writing in 1855, we also do not consider America protected for all times from the storms deriving in the States. There is gathered a number of conflicts that at one time have to erupt. The question of slavery is of such magnitude and has to be resolved at some point. The southern provinces of North America until today have a right to own slaves, quote unquote, or better to say, have and perform the injustice of slavery, as it has not been as bad with the Romans and Spartans, and it is condemned by our Holy Scripture especially. In other words, Philippson said, basically saying to his correspondent, you've got to be out of your mind. How can you, as an educated, knowledgeable, moral Jew, defend all of this? Now, Morris Mayer is probably, he's someone who simply was part of that society. Here's a very different example. There was another individual who also, like Morris Mayer, like Ludwig Philippson, participated in the revolutions of 1848. His name was August Bondy. He came from Vienna. He was part of that revolution. When it failed, he escaped arrest. He came to America during the 1850s. He went, and he is someone who became instantly an abolitionist. He saw no difference between fighting for Jewish emancipation and fighting for the emancipation of the slaves. This is a view that maybe resonates, makes more sense to us. And when I say he became involved, he became part of the group, the cohort of John Brown. Now, John Brown is one of those stories you learn in the Civil War. John Brown was an abolitionist leader. In the 1850s, he went to the Kansas-Nebraska territory. Now, this was a divided part of the country. This was part of the country that hadn't become a state yet, where the proponents of slavery and the opponents of slavery were basically fighting it out to see which one was going to be able to establish a majority in those territories. So when it became a state, it would become either a slave or free state. So Kansas was a scene of violence between abolitionists and defenders of slavery. John Brown went there basically to fight as an abolitionist against proponents of slavery. And this wasn't simply, people fighting. What both sides were doing was basically importing their supporters into this territory. They're bringing people in basically to stack the numbers. It was maybe call it like an 1850s version of gerrymandering. But they weren't redrawing the map. They were just pumping people in. So John Brown heard that 5,000 pro-slavery men were being brought in, which was going to tip the numbers because there weren't that many people. So he armed himself because he heard the pro-slavery people were armed, and they began to fight. John Brown had his famous raid. He engaged in active armed combat against slavery. He was we might call him a radical abolitionist who believed in doing anything to prevent the further spread of slavery to the territories. And August Bondy along with two other Jews, Jacob Benjamin, Theodore Weiner. These were all Jews who had come from Europe, had fought for Jewish emancipation and civil rights in 1848, came to America, and instantly became abolitionists. Now, August Bondy, he wrote in his memoir about his relationship with John Brown. I didn't put it on your handouts, just listen. This is August Bondy talking about one of these raids, one of these armed conflicts with the pro-slavery ruffians. Quote, we walked with bent backs, nearly crawled. And remember, it's him, and he's going with his two fellow Jews and John Brown and the rest of this little regiment. We walked with bent backs, nearly crawled at the tall dead grass of the year before. Might someone hide us from the border ruffian marksman? Yet the bullets kept whistling. Whiner, wiener, puffed like a steamboat hurrying behind me. I called to him, Nu, was meinen Sie jetzt? Which means in German or Yiddish, can you believe this is happening? His answer was, Sof Adam Mavis, which in Yiddish means everybody dies. Ultimately, everybody. But he's talking about the intensity of battle. This isn't simply talking about the ideas of abolition or debating the virtues of slavery. This is a Jew who came to America and actively fought against it. Later, he writes about his relationship with John Brown. We were united as a band of brothers by the love and affection toward the man who, with tender words and wise counsel, prepared a handful of young men for the work of laying the foundation of a free commonwealth. He expressed himself to us that we should never allow ourselves to be tempted by any consideration to acknowledge laws and institutions to exist as of right if our conscience and reason condemn them. His attitude towards abolition was the exact opposite of Morris Mayer. Morris Mayer saw abolition as a fanatical point of view that would spread to something anti-Jewish. August Bondi said, no, the opposite. John Brown is a guy who sees his fellow Jewish abolitionists as having the same values and the same cause. He saw Jews as comrades in arms, literally here. Now, August Bondi, in this sense, was a bit of an exception. Most Jews who became abolitionists were not engaging in armed conflict. But as we approached the Civil War, the debate really began to heat up. And in the weeks just prior to the outbreak of war in 1861, there was an exchange of ideas between three rabbis on the Eastern Seaboard. One was Morris Raphael, who was a rabbi in New York, and one was Michael Heilprin, who was a rabbi in Baltimore, and the third was David Einhorn, who was a rabbi in Philadelphia. Now, of those three, Raphael in New York, Einhorn in Philadelphia, Heilprin in Baltimore, which is the one you would expect to be pro-slavery? Probably say Einhorn in Baltimore, right? Or maybe Philadelphia. The exact opposite. The defender of slavery, the most prominent rabbinic defender of slavery in 1861 was Morris Raphael, who in 1861, he delivered a speech called, first it was a sermon, which then became a treatise or a short book called The Biblical View of Slavery. Now, he's not engaging in politics here. He's going to make a moral defense based on Jewish ideas of slavery. This is the bottom of page 2. It doesn't have a number in front of it. Okay. The subject of my investigation, Raphael writes, falls into three parts. First, how far back can we trace the existence of slavery? Secondly, is slaveholding condemned as a sin in sacred scripture? Thirdly, what was the condition of the slave in biblical times and among the Hebrews? Basically, he's saying, according to Judaism, is slavery, is this modern institution of slavery acceptable or not? Okay? I proceed to examine the question, how far can we trace the existence of slavery? Is this slavery in America something new, or has it existed forever? If we consult sacred scripture, the oldest and most truthful collection of records now or at any time in existence, we find the word eved, slave, first used by Noah, who curses the descendants of his son Ham by saying they should be eved avadim. Now, what he's using here as a defense of slavery is what comes to be known as, this is one of the widespread justifications of slavery known as the curse of Ham. Now, Ham is one of the three sons of Noah. You don't know the story, very briefly. After the flood, after they come out of the ark, Noah plants a vineyard. He gets drunk. He starts to frolic in his tent, whatever that means. And his grandson, the son of his son who's Canaan, the son of Ham, sees him in the tent and basically gossips about him to his two uncles, Ham's two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Now, according to the Midrash, it was more than just gossiping. One source said he sexually abused Noah, or he castrated, whatever it was. He behaved very badly. When Noah became sober, he remembered it all, and he basically said, cursed be the descendants of Ham, you will be enslaved to the descendants of Shem and Japheth. Now, the descendants of Shem, that's where we get the word Semite. Now, we're not really talking about being enslaved to Jews. The Semites are Middle Eastern peoples. That's really what in this interpretation, in this context, no, it meant. Japheth is the ancestor of the Romans and the Greeks, or Europeans. So basically, and of course, the descendants of Ham are Africans. So those who believe in the curse of Ham, which of course is a modern rereading, or medieval and a modern rereading of this biblical story, they use it as a justification to say, if you ever wondered about the morality or the legitimacy of black people from Africa being enslaved to Europeans or being kidnapped by Middle Eastern slave traders and brought to America or to Europe, the justification is in the story of Noah. It's in the Bible. It's the curse of Ham by Noah. Okay? And so Morris Raphael's saying, don't get mad at me. It's not me who's saying slavery is acceptable. It's the Bible. It's the story of Noah. And of course, he goes on to say, Noah wasn't the only one who talked about slavery. Part of the defense was also Abraham had slaves. Isaac, everyone in the Bible. The institution is there. Okay? Listen on the next page. The first full paragraph on page 3. Having thus, on the authority of sacred scripture, traced slavery back to the remotest period, I next request your attention, is slaveholding condemned as a sin in sacred scripture? How this question can at all arise in the mind of any man that has received a religious education and is acquainted with the history of the Bible is a phenomenon I cannot explain to myself. Basically, he goes on to say, of course the Bible says slavery is okay. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. Remember, in the law of Sabbath rest, among the people who are supposed to rest, says, Avdecha, your slave should rest. And Morris Raphael says, it's mentioning slaves by literally. They're slaves. If slavery is being mentioned there, it doesn't say, your slaves who you should eventually free. For Raphael, the Bible justified the institution. Now remember, he's not only saying it justifies slavery in the time of Abraham or David in the Bible. In his mind, the biblical acceptance of slavery meant that morally slavery is now accepted forever, as long as slave owners behave properly. And the next paragraph, it remains for me now to explain what was the condition of the slave in biblical times. And here he distinguishes between the Hebrew slave and the Gentile slave. And basically he says the Hebrew slave was required to be treated a certain way. There really were no requirements about a Gentile slave other than resting on the Sabbath. So, stop criticizing the slave. That's Morris Raphael's defense, remarkably, a Northern rabbi. Now, as you can imagine, this sermon was published, was made known, and it elicited a very powerful response from two other rabbis, David Einhorn in Philadelphia, Michael Heilprin in Baltimore. Now, I should say, Raphael, Einhorn, Heilprin, like Bondi, like Morris Bayard, these were all Jews who had come after 1848, who had fought for Jewish emancipation, who had come to America, who had engaged this problem. Now listen to what Einhorn says on page 4 in response to Raphael. It is most interesting, though, that the great theologian Raphael seriously believed that in Noah's utterance about Canaan, the lot of the Negroes has been announced. He means the lot of today's Negroes, without having a foreboding even of the confusion of ideas involved in such acceptance of this theory, and it gives evidence of his great deficiency in his knowledge of the Bible. Those who on the strength of this extenuate the traffic of slavery betray gross ignorance as well as an unbiblical conception. Basically saying, Morris Raphael, yes, you're quoting the story of Noah, but your understanding of it is profoundly narrow. Now, when he says unbiblical here, he means unlike the Jewish way of reading the Bible, because Jews never read the Bible literally. We read it interpretively and midrashically. And what Einhorn is going to say, you can't just ask what the Bible says. If you're a Jewish reader of the Bible or using the Bible as evidence in support of an argument, you have to ask what other Jewish commentators of the Bible said, because we don't simply look at the words and draw conclusions. We read it through the lens of generations of other interpretations. If we consider the inhabitants of Canaan according to their descent, nationally they would be classified as Semites closely related to other Semites. Look, it was Canaan was the one who did something wrong. Canaan is the ancestor of the Canaanites who are Middle Eastern. Why would Africans be punished, be cursed for the vice, for the transgression of someone who was Middle Eastern? Okay? He goes on to look more broadly in the Jewish understanding of slavery. Because by the time when we move from the Bible to the Talmud and the Midrash and other commentators, someone like Maimonides, slavery becomes highly problematic. The long story short is, and read a little more of this stuff, it's very interesting. The long story short is, from Maimonides, there should be no difference between the Hebrew slave and the Gentile slave. And one of the things about a Hebrew slave, the Hebrew slave, as defined in the Bible, was more akin to what we would call an indentured servant. It was a finite period of service. What Raphael neglected to look at is that eventually the slaves go free. When a slave has served for 7 years, he's given the option of becoming a free person. Raphael conveniently forgot that in the name of the difference between Hebrew slaves and Gentile slaves, but Maimonides said there's no difference between them. So Einar basically says, Raphael, you've made this very narrow argument. He basically said, you've read and interpreted the Bible as a Christian reader of the Bible would interpret the Bible. If you want to read the Bible as a Jewish expositor of the Bible, you have to read it in light of other sources as well. And basically, he tears Raphael's argument apart. Now, Michael Heilbronn, his argument is very similar to Einhorn. He makes a lot of the same arguments. The difference is that Einhorn gave his sermon in Philadelphia, which was in Pennsylvania, which was a free state. Heilbronn, he stood up in a synagogue in Baltimore and challenged the right of slavery. And you know where that story is going. Within 24 hours, he and his family had to flee for their lives from the city of Baltimore. Remember, this is early 1861. Things are really beginning to heat up. So what we have on the eve of the Civil War is we have not only two antagonistic views within America about slavery, justified both in political terms and in moral or theological terms, but we also have Jews taking sides. Now, Raphael in some ways was an exception. And later he admitted, look, I was just trying to make the proper argument from Scripture. He didn't himself support slavery. He was just trying to be true to his understanding of the Bible, and although he never fully recanted. But Jews were on both sides. And so once the Civil War began, you had Jews on both sides of the conflict as well. And it wasn't just Jews fighting for the Confederacy and for the Union because that's where they lived. Oftentimes, Jews who were fighting for the Confederacy were Jews who were defending the Southern way of life. They believed that the world they lived in, that slavery, was something not only acceptable, but it was properly Jewish. And after the war, being on the losing side, they continued to support a Southern way of life. And similarly in the North, that's how they took sides. Now, I want to mention two other things, because again, it was Philipson who had the advantage, writing from Europe, as the outsider. What he writes in the bottom of page 4. Okay, he also voices in on this dispute. We have witnessed several Jews appearing on the stage of the tragedy that is now being acted out in the United States, in the United North American States. And while the vast majority of our co-religious have been filled with enthusiasm for the maintenance of the Union and the struggle against slavery and even suffer loss and danger within the seceded states, the senator from Louisiana, Judah P. Benjamin was a South Carolina Jew who became Secretary of State of the Confederacy. After Jefferson Davis, he was the most high-profile person in the Confederacy, Southern Jew. Favors secession, and Minister Morris Raphael argues for slavery. In other words, Philipson's writing from Europe going, I don't believe it. How can it be that a Jew is arguing for slavery? But he's in Europe. And the reason he doesn't understand is he didn't grasp, and maybe it was impossible to grasp that. Jews who were arguing for slavery were basically defended, they were basically arguing from the world in which they knew. That was the America they knew, and that was the America they defended. Now there's one last example I want to mention here. This is really the last of the abolitionists in some ways. I think she's the most important one. Her name was Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose, she grew up in Prussia, which later became part of Germany. As a young woman in Germany, she was an advocate for equal rights for Jews. She was an advocate for equal rights in many ways. Eventually, she married, she moved to England, she came to the United States, and already in the 1830s and the 1840s, she became an active abolitionist. She was close friends with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In fact, Susan B. Anthony often referred to Ernestine Rose, this young Jewish woman living in the United States, as the first suffragette. Now, her main issue was rights for women, equal rights for women beginning in the 1840s. But in her mind, abolition and women's rights were inseparable causes. It goes back to what we said at the outset. She was very sensitive to this notion of the incompleteness of the notion all men are created equal, which she very much understood as all white men are created equal. And she saw the emancipation of slaves and the emancipation of women as basically two elements of the same cause, two pillars of the same cause. As an abolitionist, she fought against slavery. She supported the North in the Civil War. After the Civil War was over, she became active in trying to help freed slaves acclimate both in the North and the South. And then toward the end of her life, she became involved in the suffragette movement. So there is this trajectory of the abolition, of the Jewish involvement in the abolition movement, which precedes abolition in certain ways. It begins with the fight for civil liberty in Europe, and then abolition, and the person of Ernestine Rose, it continues even afterwards. So what emerges from all of this is the challenge of unraveling an issue which has both a political and a moral component. Now, slavery is, in American history, is probably the most dramatic example of the moral and the political, getting mushed together. It's never a good mix. It's always kind of messy. But it certainly isn't the only one. But it also, the Jewish attitude towards slavery revealed a fault line within American Jewry. The idea of there being one Jewish outlook in America, already at the time of slavery, simply made no sense. There was more than one American outlook, therefore there was more than one Jewish outlook. And Jews themselves, sometimes the debate was heated, sometimes the debate was constructive, but Jews are following the larger contours of American society. And so when we move forward from this debate from slavery, it's not surprising, but we'll see in the next two lectures the emergence of a politically conservative Jewish outlook, conservative political outlook among Jews, which we'll see next time, and beyond that, liberal and progressive outlooks among American Jews as well. Those we'll turn to in the next lectures. Thank you very much. So, how about some questions? Yeah.
So,
if you can't hear, I'll repeat the question.
So the rabbis of the 1850s, any of them that supported slavery,
right,
slavers, whatever happened to let my people go?
Whatever happened, that was one of the arguments against slavery. But remember, someone like Raphael, he differentiated Hebrew slaves from Gentile slaves and let my people go. Those were Hebrew slaves in Egypt. I know, that's a lame argument, but that was his argument, okay? The point is, and I think what it really points to is that based on what the Bible says about slavery, there are a whole bunch of different things. If you want to make the case against slavery, you can do it. If you want to make the case for slavery, you can do that too. You just got to cherry pick a little bit. Yeah.
In terms of standard of living and life expectancy, Did a slave in, say, South Carolina, Virginia, or Georgia have better or worse than a free black man in Philadelphia, Cleveland, or Chicago?
Great question in terms of life expectancy and standard of living. Let's take it one at a time. Well, part of the problem is we have very little evidence about, we know the age of slaves when they died, but we have very little information about, well, poor people who were free in general. I mean, the census was highly unreliable. There wasn't that much information, but we do know that slaves, insofar as so they could avoid the worst abuses of slavery, they could live as they were living as long as anybody else in some cases, as far as we know. We also know that the slave owners themselves sometimes would fudge the numbers. We don't have a lot of information. In terms of quality of life, it's even tougher. It depends how you measure it, because the defenders of slavery were correct in when they said slaves always had a good meal. They were never deprived of food. Even slaves who were punished, the punishment could be horrific, but it was never about withholding food. Partly because it was the efficiency of the slave as a worker. To withhold food makes them weaker. So they were fortified nutritionally. They were clothed. They were fed. They were housed. If you were a free person, black or white, many who were low income or poor were not gathered at. On the other hand, the other argument is there's a value in simply being able to control your own destiny. And so there is the case of the slave could not control if his own family was sold away from him. The free person even a free person living in poverty could continue to live with his wife, with his children. That was his decision to make. So it really depends who you ask. And the argument can be made both ways. It's a very good question. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, the Jews that came up north, for the most part, they couldn't get jobs with these companies. And so there were a lot of them, they had a self-invested.
Self-employed.
Yeah, self-employed.
They were pushed. They had a push cart.
Yeah.
They were peddlers who became shopkeepers.
Now, the ones that went down south, they would have had to have either their own business or I don't know who they would work for.
A minority of them became plantation owners. Most of them were in business with the plantations. But they were still, even if they weren't themselves plantation owners, they typically had a few slaves. But the more important thing is, they're just living there, they were part of Southern society. Where that really began to become, upended, and something we'll see subsequently, is when Jews from Eastern Europe began to arrive in the South. They didn't know from any of this. Most of them were too poor to have slaves, and suddenly these Jews were not seen as part of Southern society. But the Jews who were there, whether they were in business with the slave keepers, whether they were slaveholders themselves, they were woven into the fabric of Southern society, in the same way that Jews up north were woven into the fabric of Northern society. They typically weren't, like you say, they weren't factory owners until much, much later, but they were storekeepers, they were shopkeepers, but part of the fabric of society in their communities. Yeah.
I'm looking at your pictures here.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing, and maybe I'm missing this, but it looks like some of the rabbis are not wearing yarmulkes.
These are all Reform rabbis.
Yeah, that's what I was
Now, the 19th century Reform rabbi, in their dress, they tried to emulate the Anglican minister. They were trying. I guess they were trying not to look too Jewish. But that's what the dignified clergy looked like. They were trying not to look like a priest or like a Hasidic rabbi. Exactly.
To bring it forward to our modern time,
Yeah.
is there a Jewish attitude towards South and the civil rights movement?
Oh, great question. That's something we are going to return to when we talk about progressive Jews and Jews on the left. But by the time we get to the civil rights movement, the majority of Jews who are living in the South, they're not Southerners in the way that those earlier generations were. They were Jews who are only a generation removed from being immigrants, from being from Eastern Europe. Many of them are bringing liberal and progressive values. They're less integrated because there are more of them. There are more distinct community. And in the civil rights, the quandary from them is most of them supported the civil rights movement, but were just terrified to get involved. They knew that a Jew in a predominantly Christian, especially fundamentalist Christian part of the South, if they were too outspoken in support of the civil rights movement, their shop would be boycotted or worse. So it's a different context that we are going to revisit in a couple of lectures as well. Yeah, one more.
A modern question.
Yes.
Related back to slavery. I've seen no polling numbers. The thing that's going on right now is reparations. Do you
Right.
think in the United States, most Jewish people are for or against some concept like this?
Are Jews for or against reparation? You already have the answer to this question. The Jewish view of reparation represents the larger American view of reparation. I haven't seen the numbers of the study, but I'm willing to bet if American Jews were polled, then the percentage of Jews who are for and against is going to be very close to the percentage of Americans who are for and against, and the regional differences will be there, and the urban versus rural, and the class differences will be there. The reparations question is not a specifically Jewish question, even though a Jewish view can be constructed. This is an American political question. And so the view of Jews on the question of reparation, like the view of Jews on other issues as well, is going to be drawn not from your sense of Jewish values alone, but also from the American political values that you espouse. What? Yes.
Howard, you some people say that it was a myth that the Jews were instrumental in the
Right.
trade.
Well, they didn't mastermind it.
Why do you think that myth is around?
Why did I think what?
Why do you think that myth is around?
Oh, that myth was an attempt by, particularly the Nation of Islam, partly it's an attempt. I'll put it in sociological terms. It's one minority group that has been dispossessed, expressing resentment against another minority group, which has been phenomenally successful here. But it isn't only about economics. It's a minority group that has been. It's reflecting the frustration of a minority group that has been discriminated against and persecuted because they're not white, against another minority group, which, although in some ways also considered not white, has a much easier time passing as white. So Jews are the hidden element, the hidden non-white element in white America. And when you add that frustration to the already existing myth of that Jews control the world, and you're looking for an explanation as part of the black community, how did all this happen? The easiest answer is, you have these Jews who've been controlling everything for centuries. Obviously they did it. Now look, this is not a mainstream view in the black community. This is from a fringe group in that community. But it's for people who are frustrated and need an easy answer to a complex question, this is an easy answer to a complex question. Some people like easy answers. Some of us like more nuanced, thoughtful answers. This is not one of those nuanced, thoughtful ones. If there are no other questions, we'll continue next week. I didn't look at it a single time. Hey, carbonate.
Fantastic, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I was young and speaking for